If you haven't seen the prior videos in this series, it's probably a good idea to check those out. I reviewed the first 3 Digimon World games, and to understand all my gripes, I highly recommend you watch those 3 videos before you watch this one. Thank you. Before I start talking about Digimon World 4, I want to take a moment to lament. It's no secret that the first 3 games have big issues, but they all have their own charm. It's pretty easy to overlook these issues, at least at first, because at their core, they're built upon a solid foundation. With a few small tweaks here and there, you could easily turn those 3 titles into whatever the Digimon equivalent of a creme egg is. That's where the 4th entry comes into this little pre-review. Instead of the developers looking to the past and saying, hey, we got really close with that whole turn-based thing, maybe we should work on that until we get it right, they decided to go in a completely different direction. I try to avoid using hyperbole and extremist statements because it serves only to muddy your overall message, but Digimon World 4 is easily one of the worst games I've ever played, and I've played some fucking trash. If you happen to enjoy it and I just triggered you, before you smash that dislike button lickety-snickety, just hear me out. It's a clunky action game where the Digimon use weapons to attack, the combat system's barely a combat system, and Digivolution is near non-existent. Sounds like a perfect Digimon game, am I right? As is tradition, let's talk about the intro cinematic. If there's one consistency in the Digimon World series, it's that the opening cinematic never even comes close to the content of the game. This one gets a little bit closer, but it's still largely unrelated. There's a Leomon in the game, and there's one in the cinematic. Knowing these bastards, it's probably not even the same Leomon. The opening oversells the entire experience, as from any perspective it flat out misrepresents the product. It displays beautiful grassy plains, vast oceans, and luscious forests, but there's none of that to be seen in any of the in-game areas. The maps within Digimon World 4 consist of 2 dull brown mountains, a bland washed out swamp, and a mechanized factory full of greys and browns. Within each of these unnecessarily basic areas exist sub-dungeons, and outside of the infrequent attempt to spice things up, they do nothing to enhance the experience at all. I think the easiest way to explain it would be to quote my Digimon World 2 video when I said, quote, "As for the dungeons, they're so basic and uncreative. While the patterns on the walls and floor occasionally change, the core design never shifts from bland linear paths and empty open rooms." End quote. Since World 4 is an action title, they did try to offset the tedium by adding light platforming to justify the jump function, but it served to make the maps even worse. If it were simply ledges that were added, it wouldn't be a problem at all, and could lead to interesting combat situations where the player had to be aware of their height relative to the enemies. Why stop at ledges though? Why not add bottomless pits that reduce your health to 1? You think that's bad? Well, when you realise the game's 3D and that 3D platforming has always had issues with cameras and depth perception, it becomes even worse. But it doesn't stop there. Get this, the camera fucking controls itself and does whatever it wants, whenever it wants. So even if you have an accurate sense of depth perception in 3D platformers and are confident in your ability to avoid losing all your health for a slight misstep, you can get anally rearranged by the fucking camera. This can also be a hindrance as you prance about the map. Look at this fucking scene here. Dicky camera angle, awful janky platforming controls, and no consistent sense of depth perception, while the game Donkey Kongs your ass so hard you shit splinters for weeks. To top that all off, there are no real shortcuts, nor is there a proper checkpoint system in any map. You can teleport out of a dungeon at specific locations and resume from that same spot once, but that's it. This functions a bit differently in sub-dungeons, where enemies don't reappear until you turn the game off, but in the larger maps which house the sub-dungeons, it's a tedium-fueled nightmare. I assume this was done to make grinding easier, but I'll get to that in a minute. Sprinkled throughout these sorry excuses for maps are small nodes left by Leomon and his team. Most of the story is conveyed through these nodes, and the rest through poor attempts at exposition between supposedly high-ranking characters who do nothing but sit in a chair throughout the entire game. They are little more than beacons through which you obtain fetch quests. Between certain stages are these transitioning minigames, where you ride a vehicle of some sort and have to perform tasks that are incredibly difficult with the awful control scheme. And because there are no checkpoints, to return to certain maps you may be forced to sit through these minigames a handful of times. One such event consists of your controlled Digimon riding a raft-esque boat as you float slowly downstream while dodging attacks from either side, shooting obstacles in your way, and attempting to free Digi-Elves, whatever the fuck they are. The clear problem here is that if you don't have a ranged weapon equipped, you will fail. With enemies pelting attacks at you, Digi-Elves trapped in cages behind enemies, the inability to control the speed of the boat, and the instant death traps, which need to be dealt with promptly, it is truly fuckery incarnate. It's such a chaotic mess, and the combat system is just not built for this kind of task. The other transitional minigame has your Digimon riding a train and hitting switches to alter your course. The issue here is that not only are there obstacles to avoid and enemies to fight, but there's also no telling which path is the correct one. Since everything looks the same, it's tough to say where you are or where you need to go, and I got through purely based on luck. This, much like the previous event, is an area where you need a ranged weapon, as even if you figure out where to go, enemies can get in the way of the railroad switches, which is incredibly fucking annoying. And the strawberry on top of it all is that there are frame rate issues. The frame rate drops when too many things are on screen, and these areas are particularly bad for that, which makes it even harder. I played on a proper PS2 instead of emulating it, which is why the footage looks like shit, and I honestly thought my PS2 was gonna die, especially late game where the frame rate was easily a single digit in certain rooms. Every fucking thing about this game screams, we had no budget, no passion, and we don't understand what makes Digimon great. This is cemented within the abhorrent Digivolution system. Of the 4 characters you can start as, I picked Agumon because his Digivolution line is one of my favourites. What I didn't realise was that the process of digivolving was arse backwards. When my Agumon reached level 10, I thought to myself, surely I can become a Greymon now. 5, 10, 15 levels went by before I was on the final stage and realised that something was wrong. Upon checking the Digivolution Center, I discovered that Agumon could digivolve sideways into another rookie. I was absolutely set on a Greymon, and eventually found that to unlock Digivolved forms, you must complete specific side quests for the Digi-Elves. So I googled those, and I'm glad I did, because they try to trick you into playing them several times by having stupid, unclear requirements, and by hiding enemies and objects. Fuck that. I eventually did this side quest, which consisted of a standalone version of what you do in the main game with the same maps and enemies, but now you've got a time limit of 30 minutes. Innovation is sometimes subtle. This allowed Agumon to digivolve into War Greymon. So now I had the choice of starting again from level 1 and grinding my way back up to 25 purely so I could use a dwarf version of War Greymon who has slightly higher stats. Or I could simply stick with Agumon and beat the final stage. I wasn't going to grind for another 10 hours in this shitfuck of a game, so I proceeded to finish the rest of my playthrough with a sub-level 30 Agumon. Now, the reason I said it like that was because I didn't actually finish the game. I got to the final boss and he was simply too tough for me. 1 or 2 hits and I was dead and needed to run about 20 minutes of dungeon to return to him. Frankly, I'm not looking to grind and I'm not a masochist, so I just put the controller down. What irks me the most about Digimon World 4 is the bosses. Some are incredibly easy and some are just so difficult. There's no sense of progression and they weren't balanced at all, which means you're often left feeling cheated or disappointed. The final dungeon had 3 bosses in a row. The first 2 weren't that difficult, it was mostly just pattern recognition and tedious smashing. The final boss, however, has attacks that take up the entire screen and do well over half my health in 1 hit. This was clearly designed as a brick wall to grind through, and I'm just not fucking doing it. When you can only be asked to make 5 common enemies per map, and you expect me to grind through the same 5 enemies hundreds of times, you can suck my digi dick. Throughout the first dungeon, bosses kill you in maybe 1 or 2 hits, and I found the best way to move past them and avoid grinding was to stock up on MP chips and cheese them with ranged attacks. Fucking stellar boss design. When you get to a certain point, the bosses become trivial and serve no real threat because you can actually withstand their attacks and they all suffer from the same shitty design with idiotic AI that does nothing but follow you around. My Agumon learnt a healing spell towards the end of the second stage, which made the entire game a mash fest where I'd run in, spam attacks, and run away to spam heal when necessary. With an MP count high enough to use the healing spell a good 20 to 80 times, and having MP chips for when I ran out, death was no longer an issue. Honestly, tedium was the biggest threat facing me, and it hit me harder than death ever could. And that's a fairly accurate representation of the combat system as a whole. It rewards laziness and doesn't accommodate quick thinking or strategy because the controls and general design simply don't allow it. It's so slow, and the depth perception isn't quite there, so you'll often find yourself running in, swinging your weapon, missing the enemy, and getting hit yourself. Early on, this is a problem, since there's no affordable way to heal. If you aren't extremely careful about where you attack and how you attack, you'll find yourself dying quite a bit. The best strategy is to run in, hit enemies once, then run out and wait. There's no consistent knockback, and the enemies get knocked over after a certain amount of hits, which leaves them invulnerable until they get up. You'll find that every encounter is long, drawn out, and extremely tedious. The combat still isn't well designed by any means, and it makes this infuriating shit even less tolerable. Surprisingly, there are several types of attack at your disposal and a fair amount of weapons which have their own style, but even with all that, mashing and running is still the most viable option. If you rotate the analog stick and press attack, you'll do a whirlwind attack that has a smaller range than you'd think and is actually quite useless in groups, which is where you'd use it. There's also a charge attack, which propels you a set distance and damages anything it hits. I found it was great for moving through destroyable obstacles, but leaves you with your back turned to enemies and a fairly large cooldown window. Or you can find the animation ending inside enemies, which will damage you, making it ultimately useless. There's no dodge button, but there is a block button. It's really hard to judge where certain types of attacks will connect with you, and the block itself is quite finicky. I found it much easier just to take it on the chin and heal when necessary. This is where I found the limited number of enemies to be an advantage, because it's much easier to learn their attacks and patterns, but it's still no excuse for no enemies. I didn't try all the weapon types, but I found that most of the heavy hitters left you with a large window to be attacked and stuck to the quick dagger-style weapons, which got me through 90% of the game with relative ease. Each weapon type has its own proficiency level, and certain weapons require a certain proficiency to wield. I liked this idea, but the execution was horrible. Towards the end of the game, I had over 800 proficiency in stab weapons. It seemed like it would level up after a random amount of attacks, and it would sometimes happen so fast that I get 10 levels for one mob of enemies. When numbers flood your stat screen that fast, you generally stop caring about them. Because the game is fairly short, I think this was a rushed attempt to fit a bunch of equipment into a small game and have a decent progression curve. But again, they fucked it up, and getting a new weapon never felt special because the game was so short you get a new weapon so often. There was also plenty of reused assets for the better weapons, so that didn't really help either. You can equip armor and stat boosting items in a third slot, but I didn't play around much with this. I found armor that boosted my defense and HP, which worked well for a majority of the game, and I was only given the opportunity to upgrade them right before the final boss. It honestly didn't make much of a difference in the grand scheme of things, and the variety in armor was nothing compared to the weapons. The worst part about this is that the stat customization is almost not shit. It fell just shy of having the equipment and the longevity to make it stand out as a positive feature. Enemies randomly drop a substance which can permanently increase your stats, but I only got enough of this to upgrade my stats twice, and when you've got 800 attack, adding 2 points to that permanently doesn't make a huge difference. Maybe it becomes viable in repeat playthroughs, but for a standard run, it was utterly useless. Much like the developers of Digimon World 4. This honestly doesn't even feel like it was designed as a Digimon experience, but that they realized the game was shit and restyled it to a brand they knew would sell moderately well. In conclusion, Digimon World 4 is not something you should experience for any reason, and I'd advise against ever trying to get anything out of it. When it comes to bad games, you can generally look at them and find something of worth. Digimon World 4 has nothing to offer, and should be left to be forgotten by history as the vile piece of shit that it is. So that's it, Digimon World 4. Why would you ask me to review this? Do you hate me? It took me 3 months to play through this trash. It's only like 20 hours long. If you have any self-respect, don't play it. It should be fucking scrubbed from the earth. Expect a Cyber Sleuth review over the next month or so. I need to cleanse my Digi palette with something that isn't the equivalent of a bleach enema. Thanks for watching.